When Barron Trump visited a local war memorial, he expected a quiet moment of reflection. But what he uncovered instead was a forgotten legacy of sacrifice, a group of neglected heroes, and a startling connection to his own family that would change everything. The evening was one of elegance and extravagance, with the Trump family attending a high-profile charity gala held at a luxurious venue near a historic war memorial. The estate was alive with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the murmur of conversations about wealth and influence. Glittering chandeliers illuminated the grand hall where the event was in full swing, and Barron Trump found himself quietly blending into the background as usual. As he stood by one of the large windows, sipping on a glass of sparkling water, Barron felt an overwhelming sense of detachment. The conversations around him revolved around numbers, deals, and the latest social buzz. It wasn't that he didn't belong, it was that he didn't want to. He longed for something real, something that didn't feel so scripted. Looking out into the night, Barron noticed the soft glow of lights illuminating the war memorial just beyond the venue. Its solemn beauty called to him, offering a stark contrast to the opulence of the gala. Making a quiet decision, Barron slipped away from the crowd, stepping out into the crisp evening air. The war memorial stood in quiet dignity, its statues and plaques bathed in a gentle glow from strategically placed lights. As Barron walked among the engraved names, he felt a weight he couldn't quite describe. A connection to the stories behind the names, stories of courage, sacrifice, and lives lost too soon. But then something caught his eye. In a dimly lit corner of the memorial, away from the main path, he noticed a small group of people sitting together. Their worn uniforms and tired faces set them apart from the polished attendees at the gala. It was clear these were veterans, yet no one from the event seemed to have noticed them. They sat quietly, their gazes distant, as though carrying the weight of memories too heavy to share. Barron hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should approach. He didn't want to intrude, but their presence sparked his curiosity. Why were they here, in this forgotten corner? Why weren't they being celebrated, along with the names etched into the stone? His footsteps were cautious as he made his way toward them. The closer he got, the more he noticed. Patches on their jackets that told stories of different units, medals pinned to some, and hands that trembled slightly as they clutched paper cups of coffee. One of the men, an older veteran with sharp eyes softened by time, noticed Barron approaching and offered a faint nod. Barron nodded back, feeling an inexplicable pull to understand more. "Evening, son," the man said, his voice gravelly but warm. "Didn't think anyone from the gala would wander this way." Barron smiled faintly. "I just needed some air. I didn't mean to bother you." "You're not bothering us," another veteran, a woman in her 60s, chimed in. "It's nice to see someone actually notice we're here." As Barron sat down on a nearby bench, the conversation unfolded. He learned that the group had come to pay their respects, not as honored guests, but simply as people who had served and survived. They spoke of struggles, unpaid benefits, homelessness, and the challenge of being remembered only in stone while their living struggles were ignored. Barron's chest tightened as he listened. These were real people, living reminders of sacrifice, yet they seemed invisible to everyone at the gala. One man, after a long pause, mentioned something that struck Barron deeply. "I once knew someone from your family," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of memory. "Saved his life during a mission, but that was a long time ago. Doesn't matter much now." Barron leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean? Who was it?" The man shrugged, unwilling or perhaps unable to say more. "Just a story from a lifetime ago." As the conversation continued, Barron couldn't help but feel a growing sense of responsibility. These weren't just veterans. They were heroes who had been overlooked by the system and society. And if what the man said was true, there might be a connection to his own family that he had never known. With the sounds of the gala fading into the distance, Barron made a quiet decision. He couldn't just walk away. This wasn't just a moment. It was the beginning of something much bigger. As Barron walked back into the gala, the weight of what he had just seen hung heavily on his shoulders. The glitzy chandeliers, the laughter, and the polished speeches all seemed to blur together. For the first time, he felt like he didn't belong, not because he couldn't fit in, but because it felt so out of touch with the reality he had just witnessed outside. He found himself lingering near the edge of the room, staring out of a window toward the war memorial. Part of him wanted to brush it off and return to the comfort of the event. But another part, the louder part, kept replaying the image of the veterans sitting quietly, their stories waiting to be heard. With a deep breath, Barron made up his mind. He slipped out of the gala again and walked back to the memorial. The veterans were still there, talking quietly amongst themselves. They looked up as he approached, surprised to see him return. "You're back," the older man said, raising an eyebrow. "Didn't expect that?" Barron smiled faintly, tucking his hands into his pockets. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said earlier. I feel like, I don't know, like there's more to your story and I want to understand." The man exchanged a glance with the others before gesturing for Barron to sit on the bench. "All right, kid, let's talk." One by one, the veterans shared their stories. Each one was different, but the struggles were painfully similar. There was the woman who had lost her home because her late husband's benefits never came through. Another man spoke of bouncing between shelters, unable to find steady work despite his service. They talked about red tape, unpaid pensions, and a system that had forgotten them the moment they took off their uniforms. Barron listened intently, his chest tightening with every story. He had grown up in a world where resources were plentiful and problems were often solved with a phone call. To hear how these heroes were left to struggle made his stomach churn. The older man leaned back and let out a sigh. "We gave everything we had, and now we're just numbers on a file no one cares about, but that's how it is, I guess." Barron frowned. "It shouldn't be. You shouldn't have to go through this." The man chuckled dryly. "Maybe not, but that's how it is. Funny thing though, I saved someone from your family once, during the war. Your great-grandfather, I think." Barron's eyes widened. "You saved him? What happened?" The man waved it off. "Doesn't matter. That was a long time ago. What matters now is what's in front of us." Barron didn't press him, but the man's words stuck with him. If there really was a connection between this man and his family, why had no one ever mentioned it? Why hadn't anyone reached out to help him? That night, Barron couldn't sleep. The veteran's stories replayed in his mind, each one tugging at him to do something. He knew he couldn't fix everything, but he also knew he couldn't ignore them. If he had the resources, the platform, and the connections, he owed it to them to try. Quietly, he began to plan. He started by contacting a local historian who specialized in military records. Through late-night emails and discreet phone calls, he pieced together more of the veterans' stories, learning about their service and sacrifices. He also reached out to a veterans advocate known for her work in helping former servicemen and women rebuild their lives. In the days that followed, Barron juggled his usual routines with his secret mission. Slowly but surely, he began to uncover a web of forgotten histories, unfulfilled promises, and stories that deserved to be told. Barron knew he was just getting started, but one thing was clear. These veterans had given everything for their country. Now it was time for someone to stand up for them. Barron's determination only grew stronger as he dove headfirst into his investigation. Each day after school, he found himself engrossed in old records, news clippings, and online archives. The local historian he had contacted proved to be a valuable ally, guiding him through the process of uncovering the untold stories of the veterans he had met. Barron spent hours combing through military records, some yellowed with age, others digitized, but buried under layers of bureaucracy. He read reports of heroic missions, battles fought in impossible conditions, and medals that were awarded but forgotten over time. It was eye-opening and deeply humbling. These were men and women who had risked their lives for their country, only to fade into obscurity once the war was over. One afternoon, the historian handed Barron a thick folder. "You might want to take a look at this," he said. "It's a record of a mission that took place during World War II. There's a name here you'll recognize." Barron's heart skipped a beat as he opened the folder. The document detailed a critical mission where a group of soldiers had been trapped behind enemy lines. Among the names of the rescuers was the older veteran he had spoken to at the memorial, and among those rescued was Barron's great-grandfather. He read the account carefully, his hands trembling slightly. The veteran had risked his life to save others, including Barron's great-grandfather, who had been an officer during the war. Without that act of bravery, Barron's family history might have looked very different. "It's incredible," Barron murmured, staring at the paper. "Why isn't this in a museum or something? Why hasn't anyone honored him?" The historian gave a sad smile. "That's the thing about history. Sometimes the stories that should be remembered the most are the ones that get buried the fastest." Barron couldn't shake the thought. The veteran who had saved his great-grandfather had been sitting in a forgotten corner of the memorial, struggling to make ends meet. How could something so important go unnoticed? Driven by this discovery, Barron reached out to other veterans. He wanted to understand more about their contributions, their struggles, and why their stories had been overlooked. Each conversation revealed more pieces of the puzzle. Acts of bravery during critical battles, sacrifices that had turned the tide of war, and personal stories of loss and resilience. He also visited local organizations that worked with veterans. Some shared stories of systemic failures, benefits denied, medical care delayed, and programs underfunded. Others spoke of the veterans' unyielding strength and their determination to rebuild their lives despite the odds. With every new piece of information, Barron's commitment grew. This wasn't just about honoring the past, it was about fighting for the recognition these heroes deserved now. And as he pieced together their stories, he began to see a way to bring their legacy to light. The connection to his great-grandfather weighed heavily on his mind. It wasn't just a random discovery, it was personal. The more he learned, the more he felt the responsibility to make things right. These weren't just forgotten veterans, they were heroes who had shaped his family's history and the world as it is today. As Barron closed the folder that night, he looked at the photograph of the veteran who had saved his great-grandfather. The man's face, lined with age and wisdom, seemed to hold a quiet dignity. Barron made a silent promise. He wouldn't let these stories fade away. Barron sat at his desk, surrounded by piles of notes, photographs, and articles he had collected over the past few weeks. The deeper he had delved into the veterans' stories, the clearer it became that their struggles were far too big to solve alone. Benefits and policy reform were beyond his reach, but he knew he could still do something that mattered, make their stories heard. One idea stood out, a public event that would honor the veterans and shed light on their sacrifices. It wouldn't just be a ceremony, it would be a celebration of their bravery and resilience, a way to show the community and the world that these forgotten heroes deserved recognition. Barron hoped it could also spark change, inspiring others to step up and support veterans in need. But pulling this off required resources and influence, two things his family had in abundance. The challenge was convincing his father to get behind the idea. Sitting in Donald Trump's office one evening, Barron took a deep breath and presented his plan. He laid out the veterans' stories with the precision of someone who had done his homework, showing photographs of the people he had met, records of their service, and testimonials from those who had witnessed their bravery firsthand. He even included the story of his great-grandfather's rescue, emphasizing the personal connection their family had to one of the veterans. "These people gave everything for their country," Barron said, his voice steady but passionate. "But now they're struggling and no one is helping them. We can't fix everything, but we can at least give them the recognition they deserve. I want to organize an event to honor them, a way to tell their stories, celebrate their contributions, and remind people why they matter." Donald listened carefully, his expression unreadable. "And how do you see this working, Barron? What kind of event are you talking about?" Barron leaned forward, his eyes alight with determination. "Something public, something meaningful. We could host it at the War Memorial, invite the veterans and their families, get local media involved, and share their stories with the community. It's not just about the past, it's about inspiring people to help them now. We can partner with local organizations to raise funds, and awareness for veteran support programs. Donald raised an eyebrow, his tone skeptical. And why should the Trump organization be involved? This isn't a business deal, Barron. Barron took a deep breath, meeting his father's gaze head-on. Because it's the right thing to do, and because it shows that we care about the people who've built and defended this country. It's not just charity, it's a way to give back, to set an example. You've always said that leadership is about more than making deals. This is a chance to lead by example. For a long moment, Donald said nothing. Barron could feel his pulse quicken, unsure if his words had landed. But then his father leaned back in his chair, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're learning, kid," Donald said. "All right, let's do it. But your running point on this, if you're this passionate about it, I want you to see it through." Barron's heart soared. "Thank you, Dad. I promise I won't let you down." With his father's backing, Barron threw himself into organizing the event. He worked tirelessly to ensure every detail was perfect, from inviting the veterans and their families to coordinating with local media and community leaders. He even reached out to the historian and veterans advocate he had worked with earlier, enlisting their help to ensure the event highlighted the full scope of the veterans' stories. The event was scheduled to take place at the War Memorial, with banners celebrating the veterans' service and booths set up by local organizations offering support for those in need. Barron crafted a heartfelt speech, determined to shine a spotlight on the sacrifices these heroes had made and the challenges they still faced. As the date of the event drew closer, Barron felt a mix of excitement and nerves. He knew this was just the beginning, but it was a step in the right direction. And for the first time, he felt like he was truly making a difference. The day of the event arrived, and the War Memorial was transformed. Banners lined the entrance, bearing words like, "Honor our heroes," and "Never forgotten." Rows of chairs were set up for attendees, and local organizations had set up booths offering support for veterans and their families. The air buzzed with anticipation, and for the first time in a long while, the memorial felt alive. Veterans, their families, and members of the community began to gather. Some came out of curiosity, others out of respect. The media was there too, their cameras capturing the scene as the crowd grew larger. For Barron, it was a moment of quiet pride and nervous excitement. He had worked tirelessly to make this happen, but now it was all in motion. As the event began, the historian Barron had worked with took the podium first, setting the tone with stories of heroism and sacrifice. Next came the veterans advocate, who spoke about the ongoing struggles many veterans faced and the importance of community support. Finally, it was Barron's turn. He stepped up to the podium, his heart pounding as he looked out at the crowd. The veterans sat in the front row, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity and gratitude. Among them was the older man who had hinted at a connection to Barron's family. His gaze was steady, as though silently encouraging Barron to speak his truth. Taking a deep breath, Barron began. "We're here today to honor the men and women who gave everything for their country. These are the people who fought not for recognition, but because they believed in something bigger than themselves. But too often, their sacrifices go unnoticed, their stories untold." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. "I had the privilege of meeting some of these heroes, and their stories moved me in ways I can't put into words. They taught me that honoring the past isn't just about remembering, it's about taking action to make sure their sacrifices weren't in vain." As Barron continued, he shared some of the stories he had uncovered. He spoke of the woman who had lost her home, the man who had saved countless lives in battle but now struggled to afford basic care, and the group of veterans who had become each other's family in the face of neglect. The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. But the most powerful moment came when Barron turned his attention to the older veteran in the front row. "There's one story that's especially close to my heart," Barron said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "This man here," he gestured toward the veteran, "is not just a hero to his country. He's a hero to my family. Decades ago, during a pivotal battle, he saved the life of my great-grandfather. Without his courage, I wouldn't be standing here today." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as Barron continued, And yet, despite his service, despite his bravery, he was left behind until now. The veteran's eyes glistened with tears, his weathered face softening as he nodded in acknowledgement. Donald Trump, seated in the front row with the veterans, looked visibly moved. For a moment, Barron thought he saw his father discreetly wipe his eyes. The applause that followed was thunderous, but it wasn't just about Barron's words. It was about the stories he had shared, the lives he had honored, and the undeniable truth that these veterans deserved so much more than they had been given. The media captured every moment, and soon the event was making headlines. Articles praised the Trump family's involvement, but the real focus was on the veterans themselves. Their stories were finally being told, their struggles finally acknowledged. As the event wound down, Barron shook hands with the veterans, thanking them personally for their service. Many of them thanked him in return, not just for the event, but for truly listening to their stories. "You did good, kid," the older veteran said, gripping Barron's hand firmly. "Your great-grandfather would be proud." Barron smiled, his chest swelling with pride and gratitude. "Thank you for everything." As the sun began to set over the memorial, Barron stood back and watched as families and community members mingled with the veterans. It wasn't just a tribute, it was a beginning, a step toward making sure these heroes were never forgotten again. The impact of the event went far beyond what Barron had imagined. Within hours of the veterans' stories being shared on local and national news, calls flooded into the organizations that had partnered with the event. Donations poured in, from small contributions to substantial pledges from local businesses and philanthropists. People wanted to help. Housing programs were proposed, healthcare support was offered, and volunteers stepped forward to provide companionship and assistance to veterans in need. The buzz even reached policymakers, who began discussing reforms to veteran care at both state and federal levels. For the first time in years, the struggles of forgotten veterans became a central topic of public conversation. Barron's initiative had sparked a wave of change, proving that one small act of compassion could ripple out to create a movement. At home, the atmosphere was different too. Donald Trump, who had initially viewed the event as a one-time gesture, now recognized its broader significance. Seated in his office with Barron the following evening, he leaned back in his chair and studied his son with an uncharacteristic softness in his expression. "You did good, Barron," Donald said, his voice firm but sincere. "You took something small and turned it into something bigger than anyone expected. That's not easy to do." Barron smiled, but his humility was clear. "It wasn't just me, Dad. The veterans, the community, they're the ones who made this happen. I just gave them a way to be seen." Donald nodded thoughtfully. "That's leadership, Barron. Seeing something that others miss, giving people a platform, and bringing them together for a greater cause. That's what matters." There was a pause before Donald continued. "I've always told you to use your voice, but I'll admit I wasn't sure you'd find it in something like this. You proved me wrong, and I couldn't be prouder." Barron felt a mix of pride and relief at his father's words. "Thanks, Dad. I didn't want to let them down." "You didn't," Donald replied, his tone lighter now. "And you've set the bar high for whatever you do next." In the days that followed, Barron continued working with the organizations he had partnered with, helping to direct funds to where they were needed most. The event became a template for other communities, inspiring similar initiatives across the country. Veterans who had once felt invisible were now being celebrated and supported. Their contributions were finally acknowledged in meaningful ways. For Barron, the experience was transformative. It wasn't just about the success of the event or the recognition it brought. It was about understanding the power of action. He realized that making a difference didn't require grand gestures or endless resources. It required listening, caring, and having the courage to take that first step. As Barron walked through the halls of the Trump estate one evening, he passed a framed photograph of his great-grandfather. He paused, looking at the man whose life had been saved by a forgotten hero. For the first time, Barron felt a deep connection to his family's legacy, not one defined by wealth or status, but by the ability to lead with purpose. The evening air was cool and crisp as Barron walked up the familiar path to the war memorial. It had been several weeks since the event, but the impact was still evident. The once overlooked space now felt alive with meaning and care. Fresh flowers rested at the base of the statues, and new tributes, letters, photos, and small flags had been left by community members to honor the veterans. Barron stopped at the edge of the memorial, taking in the changes. The neglected corner where the veterans had once sat unnoticed was now transformed. A new bench had been placed there, engraved with the words, "In honor of our heroes." Nearby, a plaque stood tall, its bronze surface gleaming under the soft light of the lamps. It bore the names of the veterans Barron had met, along with the simple but powerful phrase, "Never forgotten." As Barron approached the plaque, he felt a wave of pride and gratitude wash over him. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the quiet decision to approach the veterans, the stories they had shared, and the realization that even small actions could create ripples of change. This wasn't just about the past, it was about building a better future, one where sacrifice was honored and struggles weren't ignored. He ran his fingers lightly over the plaque, pausing on the name of the veteran who had saved his great-grandfather's life. The man had become more than a name in a file or a face in a crowd. He was a hero whose story was now a permanent part of the community's history, no longer hidden or forgotten. Stepping back, Barron took a deep breath and looked out over the memorial. Families walked along the paths, some pointing to names on the wall, others placing flowers or quietly reflecting. It was a stark contrast to the solitude and neglect he had witnessed when he first visited. Barron smiled, his heart full. He had set out to make a difference for a few people, but the impact had grown beyond what he could have imagined. Honoring the past, he realized, wasn't just about remembering. It was about using those memories to inspire and create a brighter future. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the memorial in a warm golden glow, Barron turned to leave. He glanced over his shoulder one last time. The words, "Never forgotten," etched into his mind as a reminder of what was possible when people cared enough to act. And as he walked away, Barron felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't the end of the journey, it was only the beginning. If this story touched your heart, remember that change begins with just one action. Let's honor those who've paved the way by keeping their stories alive. Like this video to show your support. Share it to inspire others to take action. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us all of the power of compassion and courage. Together, we can make a difference, one story at a time.